Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're breaking down the Timberwolves defense and specifically the teams that have beaten the Wolves and at least those that have put up a ton of points, what they're doing to exploit the Wolves defense, what that blueprint is, what the common denominators are between the teams that are giving the Wolves the most trouble on the defensive end of the floor. We're going to break the whole thing down here on the show today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy Wolves game day. The Timberwolves are back in action tonight, taking on the Dallas Mavericks. Back at Target Center. We'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of the show. We'll cover the, the continuing gauntlet the Timberwolves are in and the difficult upcoming schedule as we turn the calendar to 2024. That's how we'll close the show. I want to spend most of the show, though, talking about the common denominators and really the blueprint that opposing offenses are using to try and exploit what is still, so far this season, cumulatively, the best defense in the league to this point. But what are those soft spots that opposing teams are learning how to defeat, and what is the Wolves' kryptonite? What is the Wolves' defense's kryptonite to this point in the season, roughly a third of the way through the schedule? We'll get to all that here today. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, let's talk about some soft spots in the Timberwolves defense and what some of these teams here most recently are doing to exploit those soft spots. Of course, the freshest example is the Oklahoma City Thunder, who on Tuesday night this week scored 126 or something against the Wolves. And, we talked about this in the postgame podcast. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is the exact player that can be a kryptonite to the Wolves defense. I actually don't hate the Thunder matchup for the Wolves in general. But that's not what this show today is about. I talked about that on Tuesday's show. Obviously, I was wrong in this case, but the Wolves beat the Thunder in the play-in last year. They beat them earlier this year, and albeit a close game. But SGA, when he's on his game, and the Thunder role players are knocking down open threes, he's exactly the type of player that can exploit what the Wolves do. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander shot 14 of 16 on two-point attempts during the game on Tuesday night. And I'm going to throw up his shot chart here and show you where he attempted all those shots. And if you're watching on YouTube, and this is, see if I get the right one here. I haven't done this way before. So that looks weird. Let me see if I can do it a different way. Let's see. That's actually not any better. But anyway, this will work well enough. So Shai Gilgeous-Alexander attempted 16 two-point shots. Roughly half of them were right next to the basket, like basically right underneath the basket. The rest of them were right around the free throw line. That is a common theme. If you look back at some of the other games that the Wolves have played here recently, some of the other teams that have defeated the Wolves, let's actually talk about the Kings game. Now, the Kings beat the Wolves about a month ago in that in-season tournament game. The Wolves got the Kings number last weekend. They beat them by 12, held them to just 98 points. But we also saw De'Aaron Fox do his thing against the Wolves in that game. He ended up with 27 points on 23 shots, and he was actually relatively efficient in two-point range, even though he struggled a bit from outside the arc. So I'm going to put up his shot chart. That's the wrong one. Here we go. I'm going to put up his shot chart from Wolves Kings. Same deal. A little bit less at the basket. He didn't get all the way to the basket as much. He's not as good at getting to the free throw line as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is, but you'll see every single shot he took virtually that wasn't a three, and he actually attempted 11 threes in this game. So this is only his 2-point shots. But look at all those shots that he took from about the what is that? The 6 foot mark, I think, or maybe it's the 8 foot mark at the top of the restricted area, up to the free throw line between 6 and 15 feet, right in the middle of the paint. And he was 4 of 8 on those shots, which isn't super efficient. And even though De'Aaron Fox had a pretty good game, again, 27 points, it took him 23 shots to do it. He had only 4 free throw attempts, and he was 3 of 11 on threes. The Wolves won that game, holding Sacramento to 98 points. Okay, so keep that in mind. The Wolves lost to the Thunder. SGA went off on Tuesday. Last weekend, the Wolves beat the Kings, held them to 98. It took De'Aaron Fox 23 shots to get his 27 points. I'll put up Philly now. This is a bit of a different animal because we're talking Joel Embiid, and obviously he's a big, not a guard. The Wolves let him get whatever he wanted from roughly 15 feet out to call it 19 to 20 feet. And he made hay in this game. He shot, I believe he was 10 of 14 from, we'll call it 14 feet to 19 feet. He was 10 of 14. And then look at all those shots at the rim too. But so much of these were just the Wolves, Rudy not getting out all the way to contest, in part due to foul trouble, in part because Rudy would rather not come out all the way out of the paint. And the Wolves defense is designed to allow some of these mid-range jumpers, and Embiid obviously did really, really well shooting those mid-range jumpers. Now, I want to, going back to Kings and Thunder, the biggest difference here between these two games is that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is not a very good three-point shooter, and the Wolves only forced him to take 3 threes in that game. Going back to Shai's shot chart here, he attempted 3 threes. You can actually see him there at the top of the arc if you're watching on YouTube. He missed all 3 of his 3-point attempts in that game. And he came in shooting right around 30%. He came out of that game shooting like just a little over 29% from outside the arc. So the Wolves were totally fine with him shooting 3-point shots in this game, but he was 14 of 16 on 2-point shots. De'Aaron Fox is nearly a 40% 3-point shooter, so the Wolves certainly didn't want to make him shoot threes, but it's okay if De'Aaron Fox is taking some of the threes he was taking in this game. And if I put up that, again, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll put up a bit of a cruder shot chart there. I'm partially covering my face, but you can see it. There we go. Look at all those threes he took. Those were largely contested threes. A few of them were a couple feet outside the arc. You're okay with him attempting those shots because it's better than him getting to the line, which he only did 4 times, and shooting in the paint. So, but that type of player, and then also the other piece of it is the Kings role players that knocked down shots at nearly the clip that the Thunder role players did. Lou Dort making 3 of 4 threes or something like that. Like the Thunder box score was crazy with how the role players shot the ball against the Wolves last time out. So the difference here is that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is really crushing it from that mid-range spot, whereas De'Aaron Fox was shooting more threes. The Wolves did a better job at forcing him outside of his comfort zone. But those are exactly the type of players, and I want to get to the actual teams themselves. Those are exactly the type of players that give the Wolves challenges defensively. Because, again, the Wolves defense is designed to allow teams to shoot from that 14 to 19-foot range, which is generally an inefficient area of the floor. And unless you have a superstar that crushes it from there, which, by the way, the Wolves usually start these games. Rudy Gobert is still playing drop, right? Like, Chris Finch doesn't want to switch and pick and roll. He'd love to play at the level all the time, but it's not realistic to do that for 48 minutes, especially not with Rudy Gobert on the floor. So the Wolves start these games in drop pick and roll coverage. But if these guards, and SGA is a great example, find a rhythm, then the Wolves have to change their lineups. They might have to change their coverages or both. And that becomes a little bit trickier. I want to talk about the actual opponent profile, the shot. I talked about the Wolves' defensive shot profile the other day on Tuesday's show, that the Wolves have the league's best or second best defensive shot profile in terms of the mix of shots they're allowing opponents to get and how opponents are shooting the ball from various areas on the floor. Let's talk about the actual teams that have beaten the Wolves and what their offensive shot profiles are. And that lines up with, the quick examples I just gave of De'Aaron Fox and the Kings, SGA and the Thunder, and then also Joel Embiid and the Sixers, and where these teams are really making hay. So I want to go about it from the team route. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. I'm going to go with Taurean Prince once again, old friend Taurean Prince. We'll see him Saturday night when the Wolves take on the Lake Show at Target Center. Not spectacular, admittedly so, but the Lakers absolutely need his shooting, so he's going to get some run. He himself is on a nice run here of late as the Lakers are trying to kind of stabilize, play with their lineup a little bit. D'Lo in and out of the starting lineup Austin Reeves, his role kind of in flux a bit. But Taurean Prince is a nice pickup, according to Josh. Josh Lloyd from Locked On Fantasy Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows the championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. It's the exact same with your vehicle. My first vehicle was a 95 Mercury Tracer. And if eBay Motors had been around, and maybe if I'd been a little bit smarter at the time when it came to vehicles, I certainly would have used eBay Motors and I would have gotten a much better run out of a car that I absolutely loved. It probably would have, I had a couple friends that, customized some things in their vehicles, which, we all had beat up vehicles, but tried to make them cooler. And eBay Motors would have been the perfect thing to do that. Right now, if you've got a car that you want to keep running, maybe your kid has a car that you're trying to get running, eBay Motors is the absolute best place to get the parts that you need. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Motors, eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, let's talk about some team offensive shot profiles in terms of teams that the Wolves have had to take on here lately and teams that have had success against the Wolves. Now, so far this season, the Wolves have lost 7 games. And I'm going to see if I can rattle these off real quick. They lost to Toronto in game 1. They lost to Atlanta in game 3. So they started this season 1-2. Of course, both those teams are, we'll call them inferior to the Wolves, clearly. They had the blowout second night of a back-to-back loss to Phoenix. They lost to Sacramento in the in-season tournament game on that Friday at Target Center, the only home loss to date. The loss at the Pelicans after a couple of off days. That was that Zion game where he went nuts. They lost at Philadelphia on the front end of a back-to-back. And then they lost at Oklahoma City this last Tuesday. So they've lost 7 games so far this season. Of those 7 games, of those 7 losses, 6 of them came against teams that are in the top 12 in field goal percentage from between 4 and 14 feet. So the free throw line's 15 feet, right? So we're talking elbows, free throw line inside of that, but not at the rim, 4 to 14 feet. Now, not necessarily in the paint, but field goals between 4 and 14 feet. 6 of their 7 losses have come against teams, not in the top half, but the top 12 in field goal percentage from that area of the floor. Okay, the outlier is, let's see if I can grab the outlier real quick. The outlier, I believe, is Atlanta. That's weird. The outlier is Phoenix, actually, in terms of, nope, that's long mid-range. I sorted it wrong. The outlier is, where'd it go? Oh, it's Toronto. Toronto's the outlier. They're 27th in percentage in what cleaning the glass terms. I should say I'm using cleaning the glass. They term it as short mid-range. So between 4 and 14 feet. Oklahoma City's 3rd in percentage there. Sacramento's 4th in percentage there. New Orleans is 5th. Philadelphia, 9th. And Phoenix is 12th. The Wolves, by the way, are 13th in terms of field goal percentage between 4 and 14 feet, right? So these are teams that are accurate from that range. Now, accuracy is not the most important thing. Well, I guess it is overall. The other thing that's really important to look at, though, is frequency. How often are teams shooting from between 4 and 14 feet overall? This isn't just against the Wolves. 4 of their 7 losses came against teams that are in the top 10 in field goal attempt frequency between 4 and 14. 6 of the 7 are in the top half of the league, top 15 league-wide. So this tells us a couple of things. One, I think it does tell us this pretty on-the-nose story of like, hey, teams that are good from this range of the floor, the Wolves will allow teams. Now, ideally, like the Wolves aren't, I said earlier, the Wolves are trying to allow teams to shoot in the, 14 to 19 feet, right? They don't want them to shoot between 4 and 14 feet. But this is part of what's been a little bit messy with the Wolves defense is occasionally these teams get a little bit better penetration, and depending on how tight the game is being officiated, which is a big part of it, especially against the Pelicans, the game against what was the most recent loss where it was, the Sixers, like those games that are being officiated that much tighter, right or wrong, that becomes more challenging. The Wolves allow teams to get a little bit closer to the basket, a little bit deeper penetration into the paint within that, 19 feet. You get into the 14, 15, or excuse me, within 14 feet, and you get into that 4 to 14 foot range. And these teams that are already really good at shooting from that range are comfortable and able to get there because Rudy has to drop a little bit more, or because the Wolves are trying to, change their coverage, play zone, and they're not, as crisp in those instances, or they're playing more Nas Reid and Karl-Anthony Towns in drop because Rudy's off the floor. Now, ideally, the Wolves try to play at the level more with Cat than they actually drop, but inevitably, these teams, depending on how these games are being officiated and how good these players are, get closer and closer to the basket and do really well in terms of that range. The other thing here is that means that there's 2 or 3 of those teams that don't usually play that close, or that don't usually shoot from that area of the floor, but they're taking what the Wolves give them, and then their percentage, as I talked about, in almost every case except for Toronto, of the teams that have beaten the Wolves, their percentage is high, even if the frequency isn't as high. But because they are good in that range of the floor, they take what the Wolves give them and they make their shots. So we look at the top half here. What are the teams that are outside the top 12? Like Atlanta is 19th. Now, it's been a minute since the Wolves have played Atlanta, but they're 19th in terms of shot attempt frequency between 4 and 14 feet. Other teams the Wolves have lost to, Philly's 15th. So they don't shoot a ton of them. But remember, they're 15th in terms of attempts. They were top 3 in terms of percentage from that space on the floor. Now, Embiid did a lot of his damage from the long mid-range, not the short mid-range, but that's also a Tyrese Maxey thing, right? I actually probably should have pulled the Tyrese Maxey shot chart, not the Embiid one. That would have been smarter. But Tyrese Maxey, similar story, right? Like, he shot a bunch of threes against the Wolves, but he also got to the paint. Like, I'm looking at a shot chart now. I didn't have it pulled up as a graphic for YouTube, but he was 2 of 5 from the restricted area out to the free throw line. So didn't actually attempt that many shots in that range. But again, that's what these teams are doing to put the Wolves on their heels. And then, as I said on Tuesday's show, and I mentioned it again on the postgame pod on Wednesday after the Wolves Thunder game, these teams, like these superstars like SGA and Maxey and De'Aaron Fox, they are superstars that are comfortable scoring and efficient scoring in the mid-range, but they also have another element to their game, right? So for Maxey, he's a really good three-point shooter. For SGA, he's an incredible passer, and all these guys are good passers, right? For Fox, it's really his speed and his ability to get into the paint, get to the line, get shots off from anywhere. But he's also generally a good three-point shooter, even if he wasn't against the Wolves last time out. So these guys all have another thing they can lean on if the Wolves do a better job defending in the mid-range, or they're not getting the foul calls that they'd expect, like, say, Embiid was getting or Zion was getting. By the way, Zion, as a side note, all of his shots were within the restricted area. Every single one that he shot from the field. He got to the line a ton against the Wolves. But he's a bit of Zion's his own beast, right? Like, especially if he gets whistles, you can't slow down Zion. And that game was almost fluky all the way around anyway. I don't mean that in a negative way. Zion's incredible. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. But when Zion's playing that well and he's getting a whistle and the Wolves aren't hitting on their side of the floor, like, you're not going to win anyway. But all that to say, it's these teams with dynamic, primarily guards, that can hit from the mid-range and have another aspect to their game, whether it's three-point shooting or really strong playmaking. And if the Wolves get into any sort of foul trouble, or if they get spooked at all by the way the game is being officiated, they're going to be less effective in terms of slowing down teams in the mid-range. And that's kind of a common thread that we're seeing from these players that are roasting the Wolves. Let's see. So Maxey had what? He had 35 when the Wolves played them. Zion had 36 in that game. Phoenix, I throw Phoenix out because that was the second night of a back-to-back. That was a weird one, but I've talked about this before. I hate the Suns matchup for Minnesota because Devin Booker and Kevin Durant, and last year it was Chris Paul. Last couple of years, Chris Paul. Like, those guys are so deadly from the mid-range, and again, the Wolves defense allows that. So it was never a good matchup for Minnesota. That would worry me in the playoffs as well. If the Wolves end up 2 seed and the Suns are the 7 seed or whatever, like, that would worry me. Suns are not a good matchup. I do think the Thunder, and I said this the other day, I don't hate that matchup because the Wolves have such an overwhelming size advantage. I think they can, because the Wolves, in theory, can also play small. Like, Karl-Anthony Towns clearly was not 100% on Tuesday. Eventually, the Wolves could go small more comfortably when Cat's healthy. Put McDaniels at the 4, put Kyle Anderson at the 4, really put McDaniels at the 3. There's different ways the Wolves could kind of massage their lineup to match up with the Thunder, and given the game, they're dependent on the game, they could also beat them with sheer size and brute force as well. So I don't mind that Thunder matchup because between McDaniels and Nikhil Alexander-Walker, I think the Wolves can limit SGA like they did in the play-in last year. It's some of these other ones, like New Orleans obviously always makes me nervous because you throw in Ingram and McCollum, who are comfortable to shoot from the mid range. Phoenix, I don't like that matchup. And then Sacramento, I just hate that matchup for Minnesota. Even though they did so well against them last weekend, I still worry about what that looks like. Say it is a 7-game series. It's not my favorite matchup at all because of the pace stuff. That's another one. I'm not getting into the pace really today, but that's another kind of common denominator for the most part for teams that have beaten the Wolves this year is that they play with pace. Like the only teams to beat the Wolves that aren't, top tier in the league in terms of pace. Toronto's 19th. That's actually the only team. Phoenix, I guess, plays slower. So Toronto and Phoenix are the only two teams that play a slower pace than Minnesota that have beaten the Wolves this year. Everybody else is playing at a faster pace. OKC's 8th, right? I mean, Sacramento's 11th, and last year they played even faster. So Atlanta's 5th in pace. So you look at some of these teams that play really fast. That's another advantage sometimes against the Wolves. In theory, Minnesota should be able to match that because they do have athletes and shooters and guys that should be able to get out in the open court and do damage. But that's not how Minnesota prefers to play. All right. Let's talk about Wolves Mavs on Thursday night. Let's talk about upcoming schedule. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch your winnings roll in. With basketball season now more than a third of the way over, and football season still has a couple weeks left, you can still pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League, a league created specifically for combo projections that includes 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. For example, if LeBron and Travis Kelce are playing on the same night or same day, you can take a 10.5 point combo, 3-pointers made and receptions, take more than or less than, and watch your winnings roll in. You can also take advantage of the reboot policy so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform that has an injury insurance policy. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, the Timberwolves have the Mavericks here on Thursday night, and Minnesota, of course, has played Dallas a couple of times this year. They beat them back on the 14th, which will be exactly 2 weeks prior. They beat them by 18 down in Dallas, and actually, that is the only time they've played the Mavs this year. For some reason, I had in my head they played them more than once, but this is actually only number 2 against Dallas. Kyrie Irving did not play the last time the Wolves took on the Mavs, and he still hasn't played since then. I think he's still listed as out. I'm going to make sure that that's the case here real quick before I get that info wrong. Dallas is playing in general a little bit better here lately. Let's see. Looking at their injury report, Luka was questionable to play on Wednesday night, and Dallas is playing actually right now while I'm recording this. Kyrie Irving still does not have a timetable for his return, so we will see on Kyrie. Luka, as I'm recording this, is playing for the Mavericks. And actually, no, that game just finished. And the Dallas Mavericks lost to Cleveland tonight by 3 points in Dallas. So they have to travel to Minnesota. So the Wolves do have a rest advantage here. Luka Doncic did play, and he was fantastic. He had 39, 7, and 6. And I saw the over-the-shoulder highlight, the pass to Curry in the quarter, which was just insane. The no-look over-the-shoulder pass, just crazy. So Luka did Luka things, but the Mavs still lost by 3. So the Mavs are a good matchup for Minnesota with or without Kyrie Irving. There just isn't a whole lot besides Luka that you really have to worry about. The Wolves have the size advantage. The Wolves have the advantage in almost every category. And the last time the Wolves played the Mavs, remember that was that 17-3 start or whatever it was for Dallas, and then the Wolves fell way behind, and then basically clowned them the rest of the game. So we'll see how that matchup plays out this time around for Minnesota. Again, I like the matchup, Wolves Mavs. I just do. The last time these teams played, that was that really big Nas game off the bench. This was right after Ant came back initially from the injury. Excuse me. He had 9 and 11, but shot just 3 of 19 from the field. Cat had 21 and 17. Rudy had 8 and 12, plus 5 assists and 3 steals for Rudy Gobert. But the big story was Nas off the bench. He had 27, 6 and 3. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker was also really good in this game. 13 points, was a plus 20 off the bench. And it was also a plus 20 despite shooting 3 of 19. So, again, the Wolves with the multiple defenders with length and athleticism should be able to slow down, and hopefully stop Luka Doncic. So that is that'll hopefully happen again here Thursday night. I mean, the keys to that one are basically make Luka beat you in the mid-range, show him different looks. The Wolves did that last time. They went from drop to occasionally hard hedging on the perimeter. They even switched a couple of times, just switching up coverages, having Ant play free safety in general if he's not on the ball, intercept those passes to the corner. We saw the Wolves do a bunch of that. And just expect Luka to either get to his spot and shoot, or he's going to kick it to that opposite corner, have the low man be ready. Be prepared to close out on the perimeter for Dallas's shooters. X out if you need to on the perimeter. Whatever it is whatever you need to do to be active, and try and force somebody besides Luka to beat you, or just make Luka into strictly a scorer, which I know is dangerous. But as long as nobody else is scoring, you can generally survive that. You could frustrate Luka Doncic like the Wolves did last time around, and be in a decent spot in general against them. Now, they are second in terms of three-point attempt rate. They're 14th, middle of the pack in terms of percentage. Still no Kyrie. That's a big deal for them. But, don't let Tim Hardaway go off. Don't let Seth Curry don't go off. Don't let Dante Exum, who had been crazy good right before the Wolves took them on. Be careful with him. None of those guys were factors last time the Wolves played the Mavs, but just do what you did last time. Switch up your pick and roll coverages. Try and confuse Luka as much as possible, and the Wolves should be in decent shape here at home against the Dallas Mavericks on Thursday. Upcoming schedule. I'm going to go ahead and throw that here up on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. The Wolves take on the Mavs Thursday. They're still at home for the Lakers on Saturday. Minnesota gets the Lakers twice here within a couple of weeks. And LeBron didn't play last time, of course. He should be on the court this time around. At the Knicks, that's a matinee on New Year's Day on Monday, a 2 p.m. Central tip at Madison Square Garden. Then the Pelicans again for the fourth and final time this season next Wednesday night, back at Target Center, and then back out on the road. The first time we'll see the Houston Rockets on January 5th at Houston. So a really difficult next 5 games. This is a really tough stretch for Minnesota. We've been talking about it so far. They're 5-3 in this, sort of gauntlet that they've been facing. Of course, losses to OKC, and Philly. So I guess actually they've only lost twice. If you go all the way back to the Pelicans game, these are all playoff teams, and the Wolves are 5-3 against them with impressive wins against the Kings, the back-to-back win against the Lakers, the great win against the Heat, the dominant win over the Pacers, the dominant win over the Mavs. So if the Wolves can move to 6-3 in this stretch, that would be awesome. I mean, again, the upcoming schedule certainly does not get any easier at all for the Wolves. All right, we will have the postgame podcast for you live on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube after the game. We'll also have the postgame pod Friday morning for you here at Locked On Wolves. If you can't watch the postcast live, you can catch the feed here at Locked On Wolves. You can catch the audio after the fact. A reminder, if you can't watch the game live, you can also listen on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Search Minnesota Timberwolves and catch every bucket with the hometown voice of Alan Horton. Again, the SXM app on SiriusXM. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, it's free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.